What's going on, BookTube? Today I'm going to be talking about the worst books I read in 2022. And these are all science fiction fantasy books. And just because they were the worst books I read does not mean that all these books were bad. In fact, I really enjoyed almost every single one of these novels, which I think is probably one of the best things about not being as well read in the fantasy and science fiction genre as I want to be, is that I got to spend this year reading the best of the best, because all the books that are most highly spoken about are all really, really good. So I didn't have to really depend on finding and discovering new books. I got to read books that everyone else had kind of pre-screened. So there's not a lot of duds that I read this year, but these are the worst of the best, I guess is how I would say it. With all that being said, I'm actually going to start this list out by talking about a book that you've heard me discuss how much I disliked, and that's The Poppy War. And this was super disappointing for me, because I honestly thought this book was going to be on my favorites list, and I never in a million years thought this would be on my worst list for the year of 2022. I had high expectations. It was based and paralleled real world events in Chinese history. It's got a super unique world and really cool magic system. It's got the magic school trope. I mean, what isn't to love about this book? And honestly, it came down to the writing. I thought that this book read like a first draft that should have been sent back to the author several times before ever becoming published. The book was full of inconsistencies, especially in the characters. We were told things later in the book that were different from what we actually experienced with our own eyes earlier in the books. And each character really lacked dimension, in my opinion. And I know I'm in the minority on this. Like, I know that this book is one of the most popular books out there in the past couple years. And I am a firm believer that popular books are popular for a reason, and this could have just been like a bad read for me. Maybe I need to go back and re-experience the story, because even on my review of this book, where I talk about this being like a bad book and not just an overrated book, people still stand their ground and talk about how great this book is. So maybe I need to go reread it, and I will discover there's a lot more behind the story. And maybe it was just, like I said, maybe it was just a bad read for me. But this book is the first one on the list for worst of 2022. All right, the next book I'm going to talk about is The Complete Chronicles of Conan by Robert E. Howard. And I have a lot to say about this book, because it was one of the most anticipated books on my classic fantasy TBR. I had a whole mindset about how I was going to approach classic fantasy, and I was going to start with The Complete Chronicles of Conan, because it is essentially where sword and sorcery began. Like I talk about in my classic fantasy TBR, about how sword and sorcery was essentially coined in a letter between Michael Moorcock and I'm forgetting this other author named. But it was essentially coined because of Conan. So I wanted to start there, go to Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné, and then continue my journey from there. But after reading The Complete Chronicles of Conan, I was so exhausted and tired and not excited about continuing sword and sorcery fantasy that I had to just take a breath, do a palate cleanser, explore something else. And I don't know if I've returned to my classic fantasy TBR since this book. And that's not to say there weren't good stories in this book. I honestly think one of my mistakes was reading this from start to finish instead of reading one Conan per month, which I would highly recommend. If you're about to start reading this book, I would recommend breaking it up into the different stories and seeing if it's more enjoyable that way. Because something that really turned me off was the lack of variance between stories. It's essentially the same story with the same characters, told over and over again with minor variances. So honestly, if you're going to read this book, I would highly recommend breaking it up into little chunks, and it might make for a more enjoyable story. The last thing I'll say about it is I think my favorite story in this book wasn't a Conan story at all. I think it was actually Cole of Atlantis. I think it was the very first story in this book. And I wanted to see where that story went. I wanted to follow that storyline. And like, I don't know if there is a Cole book out there. One of you guys can let me know in the comments below. But if there is, I would love to finish that story. It was a great introduction, and I was it got me stoked to finish the Conan stories. I was so down to see where this went. But honestly, that was the best there was, and it was like the very first book, the very first story in the book. So yeah, that was Conan for me. All right, next book on my list of worst of 2022 is Frankenstein, and this book wasn't bad by any means. It was just very overrated, I would say. I think one of my big problems was I just got done reading Dracula. And Dracula was a book that when I started it, I was scared it was just going to be an okay book and good for its time, but you could see its age. But that wasn't how it was. I was blown away with Dracula, and I was like, holy cow, these old books are where it's at. I'm going to experience the same thing with Frankenstein, since you hear about like Dracula and Frankenstein always being paired together because of the whole monster and Halloween thing. So I was like, you know what? I'm so excited for Frankenstein. I'm going to jump straight into it. It's also going to be one of the greatest books ever written. And I was completely wrong to view it that way. I think this is another example of where my expectation for the book made it worse than what the book probably actually was. But it was still one of the most disappointing books of 2022. With that being said, one, I do think that this book still has its merits. I think it's a very good book for people to read in school, in high school, where you can actually be in a group and discuss some of the theme around this book, because there is a lot of theme in this book, and it's really good for discussions. I would love to reread this book in a group and talk about it, because I'm going to say this, and some people may not like it, but the monster in the story, Frankenstein's monster, he is a bad guy. He's not misunderstood. Sure, he was misunderstood, but he's a bad guy. Like, he's an evil monster. And yeah, he might have been made that way, but he's still a monster. And what's worse is he ended up choosing to become a monster. Okay, moving on to the next book. Now, this book is far from bad. Far from bad. This book is only on the list because I had to choose the worst books of 2022. This is a good book. I do want to start off with all those disclaimers, because I know I'm going to ruffle some feathers with this one. And that's Stormfront by Jim Butcher, the first of the Dresden Files book. And I would just say that this book is so highly overrated, it was kind of mind-blowing. And that's not to say I didn't enjoy it. I think this book made a really good palate cleanser in between some of the more epic fantasy books I was reading. It's an urban fantasy, which I'm not used to. You're following a detective wizard, which is cool. But for Dresden Files being such a highly rated series and like spoken about so much on BookTube and in the fantasy world, I was expecting a lot more. I do plan on finishing the series. I hear it gets better the more you're into it. But yeah, I was not as thrilled with Stormfront as I thought I would be. And once again, I think it's probably got more to do with it with all the hype around Dresden Files as a whole, and not Stormfront being bad, because I did really enjoy the book. So I actually thought my list was going to end there, but I forgot about a book I read before starting my BookTube channel, and that's Midnight Sun, which is essentially Twilight told through the eyes of Edward. And I want to start off by saying that, yes, I actually love the Twilight series. It's one of my guilty pleasures. Yes, I know it's cheesy, and I'm probably not supposed to like the book, but I do. It's one of my favorite series out there. So for me to put this on the worst list means this book was pretty bad. Not only did it not add anything to the story, but his mindset is not the greatest. It's not healthy. So I would not recommend this book at all. Even being someone who has to finish a series once they start it, would not recommend. One of the worst books of 2022. Okay, so now that we've talked about the books, I do think it would be fun to rank them from best to... I'm going to rank them from worst to best. So, the worst book that I read this year is going to have to be Poppy War. I'm going to rank this book the worst for a couple reasons. One, I had the highest expectations for it, so it let me down the most. But also, the writing, objectively, if I read it correctly, which maybe I didn't, but the writing was objectively the worst. Like, period. So, the Poppy War is going to be the worst book I read this year. After that, in the second worst book category, I'm going to have to say Midnight Sun. Like, that's how much I did not like this book, and honestly would be the worst book I read this year. But even though it was a terrible story, and didn't add anything and was kind of depressing, it still had better writing than Poppy Wars. So it was a better written book, even though the story probably wasn't as good as what the Poppy War was, but the writing was better. So I'm going to rank that second worst of this year. Third and fourth is probably kind of a tie between Conan and Frankenstein. But since I'm having to choose between one or the other, I'm going to say Conan, because I think there's still a lot to gain from Frankenstein, and I think that Frankenstein should actually be like a book that you read in school. So the Conan book as a whole is going to be the third worst book of the year for me, and then Frankenstein's going to be the fourth worst book for me, even though I think that there were stories in the Conan book, in the Complete Chronicles, that might be better than Frankenstein, but as a whole, the collection was worse. Which means the best of the bad books I read this year was Stormfront. And like I said before, this isn't a bad book at all. I really enjoyed Stormfront and will be continuing the series. And I'm actually going to, I actually look forward to using it as a palate cleanser. Like quick reads that I could read in between some more heavy, epic fantasy. But I was making a list of the worst ones, and this book was just worse than the other ones I read this year. So that's my list of the worst books I read in 2022. Let me know what you think of the list. Let me know if you think anything was unfairly put on there, and let me know if you agree with any of the other choices I made or my thoughts behind them. And I'll be back soon with more videos. Like and subscribe if you want to get notified when the next video comes out. And until next time, I hope you're out there reading cool new books and exploring cool new worlds, and I will be back soon. Thanks for watching.